So, I'm going to be very interested to hear how all this works. Hey, Boulder, no doubt you've heard all the noise about polarization going on in Washington with all those negative effects, right? Well, before you get on your high horse about that, guess which state legislature is the most polarized in the nation? Yep, you're in it. It's Colorado. And yet, we tend to think of ourselves as politically moderate. We'll have more on that little tidbit later with one of today's guests, but because of that very fact, we are now the test market for a whole new political movement. I know, we're Boulder, we're used to being looked at, mostly positively. Here's another little factoid to chew on. The largest political party is not the Democrats or the Republicans. By far, it's the independents and non-voters. So right here, in our own little purple paradise of polarized politics, say that 3 times, there just may be the genesis of a sea change in our national and local political world. And where else, gentle viewer, are you going to get this stuff other than here on Deliberate Conversations? Join me in welcoming Nick Troiano of the Centrist Project, an effort exclusive to Colorado for now that could be the permanent antidote for our, let's just say it, our dysfunctional political process. Also joining me is a returning guest, Mark Gerzon. He's the president of the Mediators Foundation, located where else? Right here in Boulder. When Mark was last here in 2013, he told us of hosting over 200 congressmen from both sides of the aisle for a weekend seminar about how to get along with each other. Fascinating stuff. You can still watch that show. Just Google Deliberate Conversations Boulder and then scroll down to the show titled Transpartisanship, an answer to political gridlock. There's about 80 other Deliberate Conversations up there on everything conceivable. I stole that line from the Conference on World Affairs. So you're sure to find something that interests you because we'll talk about anything. But today, let's talk about a huge problem that affects us all and very possibly an answer to that same problem. Mark, you've written a couple of books on this in the last few years. Your most current, The Reunited States of America, and how we can bridge the partisan divide. How's the partisan divide going? How's polarization these days? We last talked about it in 2013. We're now 4 years later.
I think it's getting worse and worse. And I wrote that book before Trump was the candidate for the Republican Party and before Clinton was the candidate for the Democratic Party. And I think it's getting worse. You mentioned the Congress work. I felt that in the late 90s when I worked with Congress, the red light on the dashboard of our car of democracy came on. And that red light said, add oil. You know, add oil. Well, you know what happens to your car if you don't add oil when the red light comes on? Well, it's been 20 years and we never added oil. Yeah. So what's happening is that this, as you said, the engine of democracy is breaking down. And it's not a surprise for those of us who do this work because just like oil is far more important than when you've got a 6-cylinder and 8-cylinder engine, oil is essential. Whether you have 2 parties or 10 parties, you need a certain amount of trust and decency and civility to make the system work. And we're losing that very, very rapidly, Ralph.
Well, is it because we have a 2-party system? Because each party is playing to its base, the far left, the far right, and therefore the center isn't represented?
I think it's because we have 2 stuck, polarized parties. I don't think it's absolutely impossible to have a healthy relationship between 2 parties, just like you can have a healthy marriage or you can have a dysfunctional marriage. So I think it'd be possible to have a healthy relationship between 2 parties. At the moment, we don't have that. And I think the only way to help bring health into that system is for these independents to start speaking up and let their voices be heard. And either, if you're a committed Democrat or Republican, work like hell to get your party healthy, creative, and collaborative. Or, if you're not a committed Democrat or Republican, start to look at some of these other ways of getting involved, including the Centrist Project, which we're going to talk about.
Sure.
Get involved in something else that adds oil to the system. And we need to either make those 2 parties healthier or we need to create a third. And I sometimes think that the only way to make them healthier is if they feel, looking over their shoulder, a third entity that's saying, it could be a party, it could be a project, it could be a movement, but there has to be some third force, just like a couple when they're really dysfunctional. They'll go see a therapist because, hey, wait, we're in real trouble, let's go see a therapist. You add that third ingredient, the catalyst, And so I think the Centrist Project and other projects out there that I'm involved in are part of that catalyst that's going to break it open.
Well, you mentioned in your book how the largest political party, I mentioned in the setup, are the independents and non-voters. And Nick, I guess that's the third party you're interested in. Tell us about the centrist.
It might be the unparty, as we sometimes
call it. The unparty, yeah.
But in Colorado, independents, active in voters, are independent, 36% of the electorate, compared to 31% each for both parties. Over 1.2 million. The stunning thing is there's not a single legislator out of 100 who are actually independent, and that's what the Centrist Project is out to change.
Now, is that the genesis of the statement that Colorado has the most polarized legislature of any in the states?
Believe it or not, that's true. I mean, two professors, one from the University of Houston, one from Princeton, done an analysis looking at roll call votes over the past couple decades and have found that the Republicans in the state Senate and the Democrats in the state House have each marched towards their respective extremes, which means the center has fallen out. Where there was once room for people of good faith to find common ground, there is not that space anymore. And so our objective is to fill that center again with independents who put the state first, who can follow the facts, and who want to work with others to actually get things done.
Well, in a way, that sort of reflects the general populace because, Colorado seems to vacillate between red and blue, and therefore we get the title of purple. And we have a state legislature that is almost perfectly divided between Republicans and Democrats. Is that gridlock by definition?
I will say that the state legislature is narrowly divided, but it is also deeply divided because of the Republicans and Democrats who are there. They represent the extremes disproportionately of their own party. They are not representative of where most Coloradans are, which are not in the far left or far right, but somewhere in the middle.
So Colorado is a good test case for what you're trying to do, but that isn't where you started, is it?
I'll just say one more thing. Why it's a perfect test case for the Centrist Project is because our theory of change is focused on what we call the fulcrum strategy, which is that we're not out to elect more independents than Democrats or Republicans. That might be nice down the road. We're out to elect a sufficient number to deny both parties an outright majority. We call it the fulcrum strategy, where if independents can control the balance of power, they will have an incredible amount of leverage to force compromise because both sides will need their votes to get anything done. And those independents can decide, who's in the leadership of the institutions. Is it people who are just concerned about putting points on the board for the next election? Or do we have leaders of our governing institutions who actually want to solve problems? And that's needed in today's environment. You saw what happened in the special session recently in October, where both parties reconvened and couldn't even figure out a fix for a mistake they all agreed was a mistake that is costing the state hundreds of thousands of dollars each month because of a drafting error. They can't even do the most basic functions of government. And so, to Mark's point, our perspective is that means there needs to be some new competition and innovation in the system.
All right, so how's the Centrist Project going to do that? What are you going to do here?
Well, we have to replicate some of the structures of the parties in order to compete, which means we need to recruit candidates, we need to build a network of volunteers and donors, and we need to create the talent and technology for candidates to run competitive campaigns. So this is a third-party effort. We're not a party. We're creating the structures to empower independents who are independent of parties or special interests. We don't have a top-down, policy-driven ideology. We're about trying to support people who can do what's in the best interest of all their constituents, not just of one party or the other.
But you're an organized effort to do that.
Absolutely, and that hasn't existed before.
Mark, in your book, The Reunited States of America, you cite a number of examples where I guess I'd call it at the ground level. There's this, what do we call it? Independent activism or something?
Well, you can use whatever word. You can use centrist, you can use independent, you can use transpartisan.
But it's distinctly not Democrat or not Republican.
Yeah, it's basically saying you're not going to get there from either of those extremes. We're not going to get to a solution because every strengthening of this extreme creates the strengthening of that extreme.
Sure.
And Obama creates a Trump, and a Trump is going to create its counter-reaction, and that's fine on one level, but at some point we have to solve problems. We have to make decisions. And And the other analogy, I use the car analogy, I'll use for those of people who are listening who might be more interested in cooking than cars. You can put a lot of wheat in there and cut a lot of grain in there, but ultimately you need some yeast if you're going to get some bread. And I think what Nick is talking about is the yeast. 3 or 4 independents in our legislature, 3 or 4 independents in the U.S. Senate, suddenly it's a different ballgame because that little group is actually not tied to that Democrat. That would create a greater health in both parties because suddenly both parties would say, oh, we're actually going to have to work with those independents and possibly even the other side to solve this healthcare crisis.
We've seen this recently with the recalcitrant Republicans, 3,
That's
4,
right.
5 of them.
That's right.
It's determining.
They're
healthcare.
acting in a way as de facto independents. De facto, and we see how healthy that is.
So, Nick, you're basically looking for people to run for political office. But you started, I think just a few years ago, trying to do this nationally. Is that true?
Yes. This here book, The Centrist Manifesto, is what launched our organization, written by a professor at Dartmouth.
Manifesto, that
Whelan.
word might get you in trouble.
Well, the point of it is that centrists and independents aren't wishy-washy. We're not in the middle. We actually are passionate. We know what we believe. It's just that we're also folks that want to work with other people to get things done. And so Manifesto is supposed to be sort of representative of a style that we're not tepid. We're here to make a difference.
So you're looking for people to run for political office. And how are you finding them?
Well, we're reaching out to them. We know some districts around the state where we think that there is a particularly strong pathway for an independent, and so we're reaching out proactively to teachers and community leaders, people on the Rotary Club, people in the Chamber of Commerce to say, you're a leader in your community, would you consider running for office as an independent? And what's really gratifying about this work is that there are a lot of people out there who wouldn't otherwise run for office through the hyper-partisan primaries, but for a new vehicle to do so in which they have to be tethered to the parties. And so we're getting an extraordinary quality of leaders that we're talking to who are interested in running, and our goal is to run a slate. So it's not just one person in one district, but an actual team of independents who are out to reform this state's politics for the better.
Okay, so let's assume you find some good folks that want to run. Normally, a party runs on a platform. There's a few basic principles that everybody's supposed to sign on to. Is that the case with the Centrist Project? You have a basic platform?
Well, we're going to leave it to the candidates to drive a lot of that process. Are there a couple issues where they see an opportunity to make a difference as a coalition within the legislature? Could it be on education or infrastructure, on healthcare, issues that have been victim of the gridlock and dysfunction there. But what they will share in common is an approach to governance that is about problem solving and not just about point scoring. And that makes a difference because it's not only about what they can do as individuals. To Mark's point, there are good Democrats and good Republicans who also want to get things done. They can help give them cover and give them a space to come together to advance some of these policies.
We're going to take a break, but when we come back, I want to talk more about the platform. How do you keep from, a Democrat claiming to be a centrist or Republican or whatever? And Mark, I think that ties into the points you were making in your book about what the key elements, there's 4 of them, that need to change in order to accomplish this. This is a fascinating subject, folks. And we're going to be back, but we'd like to thank our sponsors, the Boulder Daily Camera, your source for local news. That's where I get my information. And also Flatirons Bank. It's the only bank that's chartered in Boulder County, serving Boulder County. Those are good folks. We'll be back in just a moment.
On Deliberate Conversations, we take it one subject at a time. But the current show and all of the past shows are online at boulderchannel8.com.
How good is Flatirons Bank? Well, every 3 months, Deposits.com evaluates 6,200 banks, and Flatirons Bank got an A+. You can't get a higher rating than A+. It's the way banking used to be, and still is, at the only bank chartered in Boulder County, Flatirons Bank in Boulder and Longmont. Okay, we're back, and we're talking about polarization and political gridlock, and perhaps some answers here. Nick, the Centrist Project, you're looking for people who want to run on, for lack of a better term, a centrist platform. What are the major points of that platform?
Well, what we mean by centrist is not splitting the difference between both sides, but actually championing the best ideas that both Democrats and Republicans have to offer, as well as some ideas that neither party is willing to champion, such as fundamental reforms to our political system. So generally, our candidates will be fiscally responsible and environmentally responsible.
Yes.
They don't believe we should live beyond our means at the next generation's expense. We're pro-growth. We want to see more jobs, more business, but we also think there should be a safety net for people who need it. So like I said, championing the best ideas from both sides, but also sharing that approach to governance, that government is here to actually get things done for the people and solve problems, and that legislators and leaders shouldn't be beholden to the party bosses or the special interests that have too much influence in the system today.
Now, you're not focused on this year's off-year elections. You're really pointing more towards next year's elections, right?
Yep, we're focused in the 2018 midterms for state legislature here in Colorado. And we will have endorsements, and we'll be supporting some statewide candidates across the country for governor and Senate.
And is it going well? Are you getting some good people in there?
Yeah, particularly after the 2016 election, I'd say we have more traction now than we've ever had. People are ready for it. We've recently released a report called Colorado's Sleeping Giant, which is about independent voters and are voters ready for independent candidates. And what we found was 85% of voters said they'd be open to supporting an independent. And what you might not realize is that that includes 82% of Republicans and 84% of Democrats.
Yeah.
So both parties are ready for this.
Yeah,
and that includes people who would only vote for their party or the other. I mean, we found a party to hate. We haven't found a party to love in the current political environment.
That's a good line. I like that. I'm a bit of a political junkie. I'm from Chicago, where politics is sport. Mark, in your book, you talk about not a platform, but the process, the viewpoint that a person in a centrist mindset has to have. You make 4 points. The first one being confirming to learning. What does that mean?
Well, I think the kind of candidates that are going to gravitate to what Nick is talking about are going to be people who want to learn new ways. They're not going to be there reciting a liberal ideology or a conservative ideology. They're going to be saying, hey, we need to find a new way of balancing environment and growth, for example. But they're learners. They want to learn. They're not going to try to just go back to Adam Smith or Karl Marx or whoever. They're going to say we have to learn together. Most of the issues we face, whether it's internet privacy or nuclear weapons, the founding fathers didn't deal with internet privacy. They didn't deal with nuclear weapons. No. They didn't deal with, all these issues that are now gun violence and some of the guns that are out there, AK-47s. There were no AK-47s in 1776. So we have to be learners. And that relates to the second point I make, which is
controlling to relating.
Yeah, centrist candidates are going to say, I happen to be more progressive in this way than some people. I'm going to work with more conservative ones because I realize Colorado, if it's going to work for our state, I've got to work with the other side. I've got to work with people different than
so
me.
Instead of saying, I've got this power now, and I'm going to use it just to jam my program through, rather, or to have this position of power, but I'm going to try to incorporate more folks.
And the third ingredient, I think, of some of these centrist candidates would grow right out of that, which is if you're a learner and you're willing to have a relationship, why? Because you're trying to solve a problem. Fracking, what are we going to do about fracking? You know, that's really divisive in this state, and I mean, we're going to have to work together to find a new way of getting the energy we need, but not destroying our environment. So that's naturally going to lead to a problem-solving orientation. I think that's the general personality of a centrist.
So the idea is, instead of taking a position, I'm anti-fracking in every sense, or I'm pro-fracking in every sense, I'm looking at the problem.
That's right, and I think anti and pro are words that are going to get increasingly off the table, because to be anti or pro growth, I mean, what ridiculous options. To be anti, and to me, abortion always illustrates that. It's like you want to be either protect the mother's rights or you want to protect the infant's rights. Well, what about protecting both of their rights? I mean, that's the natural thing. It's a mother and a child. Why would you try to divide them? So I think what Nick is doing and our colleagues in this field are doing is absolutely essential, because we've lost the capacity to solve problems.
Well, Nick, so let's say you find some good people, and they're filled with enthusiasm to do this, but they're neophytes. They don't have any political experience. Are they going to get chewed up in the process?
That's why the Centrist Project exists, because traditionally that has been the case. You know, when I ran for office as an independent, when others have, you start from scratch, you don't know what you're doing. You do your best you can for one cycle. Everything that you've built, if you don't win, disappears. And so that is a cycle of defeat that independents consistently face. but for the introduction of some institution, some infrastructure.
So how are you going to solve that?
Well, what we've done here in Colorado, for example, is we've hired a team of talent. Some who've come from the Democratic side, some who've come from the Republican side, some of whom have even been in races in opposition to each other in the past, who realized they got into politics to make a difference. It's not happening through the parties anymore. So they've come together to offer world-class support and services to the candidates who run as independents, so they can get training on how to raise money and how to use social media and how to organize volunteers.
So is this part of what the Centrist Project is doing, is providing this support, this training for these folks?
Yep, we'll offer the support and services, and then of course resources. We need resources to be able to compete, and so we're raising money for the candidates themselves in the future. We've already started raising money from small donors in a small donor committee that can contribute to candidates, and so they'll have resources there to help them get their message out as well.
Well, we've heard that money is the mother's milk of politics, and I think that relates to your fourth point in your book, endless campaigning to public service. Endless campaigning, I think, is a lot of it is endless fundraising.
That's right. There used to be that you'd have a thing called an election, and the campaign would end and people would start to govern for a period of time. And now they're already preparing for the next election and campaigning, which is why one of the projects that Mediators Foundation is involved in is we're bringing together some of the major national funders on the right and some of the major national funders on the left, bringing them together in November on the East Coast and saying, how do you feel about the role your money's playing in America? Are you happy with the impact it's having? And they're coming to the meeting because they realize it's having a negative effect. So even money, even finance is moving in this direction of saying, if all of our money is going to right-wing candidates or all of our money is going to left-wing candidates, are we really making America a better place?
So is the ultimate goal to reduce the influence of money in the process? I mean, that might be I know it's a subject in and of itself.
It is.
But so that they can focus more on public service and less on
It's
fundraising?
to reduce the role of money, but it's also to make sure that insofar as money is there, money is also there for centrists. Money is also there for people who are trying to solve problems. We're never going to stop funding on the right and funding on the left. I mean, that's people's freedom to fund the right and the left. We just like to see more funding going to actually solving problems, and that usually means some form of dialogue or deliberation or a candidate who's willing to talk to both sides. So I think it has to happen on the citizen level and the candidate level. That I think the strategy of the centrist party is extremely sound. It has to happen in people who hold elected office for it to have traction. It also says that the citizenry has to be supportive of them and engaged with them, because if it's just 3 or 4 isolated independents up at the top with no citizen movement, they'll be isolated. So it has to happen on both levels.
Well, I think it's fertile ground, this huge non-party, if you will. And we certainly have heard so much about polarization and, the ratings of Congress is at an all-time low. So that suggests that what you're doing could get a lot of traction, but it takes money.
Well, you may scratch your head and say, well, if everything's so primed for this, why hasn't it happened already? This will happen when people believe it can happen. Our biggest barrier is not structural so much as it is psychological. Until voters believe there can be a viable alternative, there won't be. And so a lot of our strategies around how do you engineer the first few wins and successes so that people realize there is a viable alternative to the 2 options that we're being given that we don't like right now. And that's in part why we're starting at a state level. We have to build this from the ground up. The people that we elect can be our congressmen and our governors and our senators a few cycles from now. That's
you can't really start at the national level. You got to grow into it. Maybe it's a case where it has to get worse before it'll get better, and we might be at the worst time. Because you were talking about that red light going on 10, 15 years ago, and it's not gotten better. So these people are going to get the training, they're going to get the support. Do you have a plan for how they get exposure, I guess?
Well, I think what's really interesting is when you have more than one of them, it becomes a story. It becomes a story that people want to talk about, that media wants to cover, and that can shine a spotlight on the idea that there's a solution to our politics. Because right now, for people who aren't ready to double down on the resistance or aren't ready to sign up on the Trump train, where do you go? What do you do if you want to have a positive impact on politics? So I think as people are exposed to a pragmatic and positive solution, they'll be willing to sign up. And that's why I think we can imagine a campaign of these candidates traveling around the state together and saying, if you're sick of the status quo, here's something else that we can do.
You know, I'm thinking of Ross Perot. There was a lot of energy behind his campaign, regardless of what you think of his positions or whatever. And that was, 20 years ago?
But that was still a cult of personality. And what's so great about this strategy is it's not about one candidate who's an oddball. That if this project's successful in Colorado, we'll see 5, 6, 8, 12, 15 people saying, I'm running as an independent. And then Nick's right. Then it becomes a story, and it's no longer about this person's funny ears or this person's funny behavior or the fact that they're a gay or lesbian or a businessman or whatever they are. It's actually a movement, and that's what the truth is. That's actually the truth out there. It is a movement.
Now, when you had those meetings on the East Coast of major fundraisers, and you say they came to the meeting, would you even speculate that if those folks would consider funding an independent effort?
Well, it's coming up in November. It hasn't happened yet. But
right.
I do feel that one of the natural outcomes of that is to change the profile. So instead of going, we're a funder who's behind, this person who's a Democrat or this
right.
one, there's going to be more and more funders who say, I want to put at least some of my money behind candidates who are trying to make a difference, or groups of candidates that are working together. The No Labels Problem Solving Caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives is about 80 members of the House. Funders are starting to be drawn to that. Oh, there's Democrats and Republicans working together. I think the same thing will happen in Colorado. If some very unusual and creative independents, and some of them will be leaning more liberal and some of them will lean more conservative, but people will say, wow, this is far more exciting than funding the problem. I want to fund the solution.
Because think about their return on investment right now. If you're someone who cares about getting action on climate change or getting a deal done to reduce the deficit, you can keep funding Democrats and Republicans who keep failing to address these issues. And the worst thing that we can do is nothing on them. I mean, these are issues that are compounding with time. So investing some money in the solution, which is fixing governance, would seem to make sense to me.
We're a little short on time, but you recently released a paper. Tell me about that. We're down to about 1 minute.
Sure. I mean, the report that we released was making the case that Colorado voters are ready for independent candidates. This is the work that the Centrist Project Institute did, found 85% support. It also found that about half the people think having independence in the legislature would improve things. Only 5% said it would make things worse. And so people have an openness to this idea. And also found that independent voters are almost like a bell curve. 36% consider them centrist. Only 10% say they're very conservative or very liberal. And it's the case that 75% of independents split their votes. They'll vote for some Republicans, some Democrats.
And that report sounds like, we should start in Colorado.
Absolutely.
Right?
People are ready.
Hopefully this is the beginning of a movement that can begin to address that polarization.
Absolutely.
We can certainly talk about this a lot more, but we're out of time. I want to thank my guests, Nick Troiano of the Centrist Project and Mark Gerzon, the Mediators Group, Foundation, sorry. And of course you, as well as our sponsors, the Daily Camera, Flatirons Bank. And come on back next time, because there's always something to talk about, and we'll do it. We'll see you then.